As we enter into the second chapter of the book of Job, we're going to see a situation move from what we might call bad to worse. And I found this silly little picture here about that. That's a cat, if you can't see it real well from where you are. And he's wearing one of those collars around his neck, to protect him from scratching. And somebody has dressed him up in a onesie. And his little thought was, when I said it couldn't get any worse, I didn't mean that as a challenge. So let me remind you of what Job has suffered so far. In chapter 1, the verses we looked at last week, Job lost all of his property. In other words, all of his herds, his camels, his sheep, his goats, done. Some were killed, some were stolen. All of his servants, except for the ones that came as messengers, were killed. And all 10 of his children, his 7 sons and 3 daughters, killed. All of this within a span of maybe an hour, tops. And amazingly, Job, throughout all of this, kept his faith. And rather than cursing God, as Satan predicted he would do, he blessed God. He worshiped God. But of course, now things are going to go from bad to worse. And here, starting in verse 1 of chapter 2, we see this. Again, there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord. And Satan also came among them to present himself before the Lord. The Lord said to Satan, "Where have you come from?" Then Satan answered the Lord and said, "From roaming about on the earth and walking around on it." Other than the word "again," those verses are identical to what we read back in chapter 1 when Satan first approached God about what he's been doing, and God pointed out Job. The difference is going to be what happens in these next pieces of conversation. In verse 3, it says, "The Lord said to Satan, 'Have you considered my servant Job? For there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man, fearing God and turning away from evil.'" That is also something God has already said in the previous conversation. But here's where it changes. God says, "And he still holds fast his integrity, although you incited me against him to ruin him without cause." Now, again, the verse 1 starts with this word, "Again there was a day." So this is a separate day from the day when the first tragedy struck. But I don't think it's very long thereafter, because Job is still sitting on the ash pile when all this transpires, trying to recover from the shock of the first set of tragedies. And here, Satan is desiring another shot. He wants another shot at Job, because it really probably irked Satan that with all the misery that he unloaded on Job, it still didn't shake Job's faith. And in fact, I just get a sense that God is rubbing it in when he says to Satan, "Have you considered the fact that Job still holds fast to his integrity? Not like you said he would, not cursing me like you predicted. He's still holding on to his integrity." Now, I put in bold those two words, those last two words. I want you to just lock them in somewhere in your thinking, because God clearly states here that Job's ruinous misfortune was without cause. The reason that's going to be important is because in the coming weeks, as we look at the encounter between Job and his 3 friends, and then a 4th one joins in as well, they are going to refuse to consider the possibility that any of this happened without cause. They're going to say this: there had to be a cause, and you were the cause, Job. The entire discussion is going to be them accusing Job of having brought this about by himself. And we need to know, we need to hold it in our minds as we review their discussion, that God has already said everything that happened was without cause. In other words, Job had no blame in bringing it about. Now, starting in verse 4, Satan lays out his next line of attack. It says, Satan answered the Lord and said, skin for skin. All that he has he will give for his life. However, put forth your hand now and touch his bone and his flesh, and he will curse you to your face. So the Lord said to Satan, behold, he is in your power. Only spare his life. See, rather than acknowledging Job's faithfulness, rather than admitting he was wrong, Satan simply shrugs it off and says, that's because you didn't let him be hit directly. You let me hit his stuff. You let me hit his family. You didn't let me hit him. But now he will. It says in verse 7, then Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and smote Job with sore boils from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. And he, meaning Job, took a potsherd, a piece of broken pottery, to scrape himself while he was sitting among the ashes. So the only restriction at this point that God puts on Satan is you can't kill him. You can't kill him. So Satan says, well, what's the worst possible thing I can do to him? I think I'll cover him with boils from the bottoms of his feet to the tops of his head. Now, in case you think, oh, well, that's really not that bad. I want to remind you that boils were one of the plagues that God sent on Egypt. If you go to Exodus chapter 9, verses 8 to 11, we see this. Then the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, take for yourselves handfuls of soot from a kiln, and let Moses throw it towards the sky in the sight of Pharaoh. It will become fine dust over all the land of Egypt, and will become boils breaking out with sores on man and beast through all the land of Egypt. So they took soot from a kiln and stood before Pharaoh, and Moses threw it upward towards the sky, and it became boils breaking out with sores on man and beast. The magicians could not stand before Moses because of the boils, for the boils were on the magicians as well as on the Egyptians. I don't know how many of you ever had a boil, okay? I think for me, maybe I got sunburned this summer. You know, I'm really pale, Roger. So I don't go out and I'm half albino. You know, I have all this skin that won't tan. But when Julie came back from Ecuador, she and I went out kayaking for what, like a couple hours? Not smart. So I got these boils, these burns on my shins, and it was like painful to walk because the skin was so irritated. Job's got these things all over him. There's not an inch of his body that doesn't have boils on it. And he's already now sitting on this pile of ashes, mourning the deaths of his children, and now all of a sudden, boom, he's covered with boils. So he just picks up a piece of broken pottery and starts to scrape the skin, letting the boils drain one by one. And in the midst of this misery, his wife comes to give him this piece of encouraging advice. Then his wife said to him, do you still hold fast your integrity? Curse God and die. Thanks, honey. Appreciate it. Love you too. Here's the thing. She identifies the key element in what's happening here. That it's another wave of attack, and in the midst of this another wave of attack, this guy is holding fast to his integrity. Do you know why? Because it's all he has. Let me tell you something about integrity. It's so precious because when you're attacked and you lose something, whether it's financial, your car breaks down, it's toast, you better get a new one, it's gone now. Whether it's your health, you go and you have this pain or that pain, you get this diagnosis, that diagnosis. Whether it's your family, somebody passes away, one of your kids goes wayward. Whatever that attack is, they can take all kinds of things from you. They cannot take your integrity. The only way you can lose your integrity is to give it away. Is to lay it down and refuse to hold on to it. But Job isn't going to let go. They took it all, but not this. And I will hold this with everything that's within me. Now, I want to say something in defense of Job's wife. She doesn't come across real well. But we don't know her heart. And some scholars believe that she was really simply burdened for Job's pain. And because she believed that if he would curse God, God would kill him, she just wanted to see the poor guy out of his misery. Just do it and die rather than suffer. But you see, Job, even with everything he's been through, even with his body covered in boils from head to toe, he's not looking for the easy way out. And he's not blaming God for any of this misfortune. He says this back to his wife. But he said to her, "You speak as one of the foolish women speaks. Shall we indeed accept good from God and not accept adversity?" In all this, Job did not sin with his lips. James chapter 5, verse 11, James writes, "We count those blessed who endured. You have heard of the endurance of Job and have seen the outcome of the Lord's dealings, that the Lord is full of compassion and merciful." Now listen. What he's pointing out, look what he says. You have seen the outcome of God's dealings with Job. What does that mean? We talked about this last week. We know how the story ends. We know that God comes back with compassion and mercy upon Job. We know that he ends up with twice as much as was taken from him. Job doesn't know that. Job has no idea what's going on, why it's happening, or how it's going to turn out. That's why it's so incredible. See, if you're in a horrible situation and somebody says, "But in 2 weeks it'll be okay," well, okay, I'll hang on for 2 weeks then. For as far as Job knows, this is his life for the rest of his life. Lose everything and get covered with boils. There's your life. He doesn't look for a happy ending. He doesn't know Romans 8:28. Romans 8:28 hasn't been written yet. He doesn't know that God works all things together for the good. He simply says this: God is God, and when he gave me good, I accepted it. If God's allowing bad into my life, what am I going to say? You can't do that? He's God. When we find ourselves in situations where affliction is surrounding us, where we don't understand what's happening, we have to try to be aware, as Job was, that somehow in the midst of all this craziness, God is still God. God is still in control, and God is still worthy of our praise, no matter how bad things are. And like Job, we need to understand that rather than looking to blame God when things aren't going the way we would like them to, we should say, maybe there are other sources of my distress. And I want to cover a few of them briefly. First of all, it is appropriate to consider that it could be a direct satanic or demonic attack. I said last week, Satan can't be everywhere attacking everybody all the time, but he does attack some people some of the time, and his demons do a lot of it for him too. We see in Luke chapter 13 that Jesus heals a woman on the Sabbath, And then he confirms the fact that her infirmity was a direct demonic attack. He says this in verse 16, "And this woman, a daughter of Abraham as she is, whom Satan has bound for 18 long years, should she not have been released from this bond on the Sabbath day?" He's clearly saying this woman's infirmity, she was bent over, she had this horrible back problem. He's saying, Satan, that was Satan. That could be the case in your situation. It could be a direct attack from Satan. It could be demonic influences coming into your life. Secondly, our troubles sometimes are caused by ungodly people who are in our environment, in relationship with us. In 2 Timothy, as Paul's closing, he mentions to Timothy two people who have done him wrong. He says, "Alexander the coppersmith did me much evil." And then he says, "Demas has forsaken me, having loved this present world." Sometimes you're going to have suffering in your life because there's an Alexander in your environment. There's a Demas in your environment. And by the way, these guys used to be Paul's friends. So maybe the person who's causing you distress was one time your friend, but for whatever reason they've turned against you. And that can be a cause of suffering. The third thing that can cause suffering in our lives is the fact that the world system of this world that we live in is inherently evil. And we're stuck here. We see in 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 8, Peter's describing what it was like for Lot, who was a righteous man, living in Sodom, which was an unrighteous place. And he says this, "For that righteous man dwelling among them in seeing and hearing the very things that were going on around him, vexed his righteous soul from day to day with their unlawful deeds." There's a lot of that stuff in our environment. There's a lot of that stuff on the television. You just look around, and that kind of evil can cause us suffering. We're in an evil world. The fourth thing is simply this: our own fallen nature that is still hanging around, trying to hurt us. In Romans 7, 14 and 15, Paul says, "For we know that the law is spiritual, but I am carnal, sold under sin. For that which I do, I allow not. For what I would that do, I do not. But what I hate, that I do." See, we have this old nature that Christ has set us free from. But just like I said, just like nobody can take your integrity unless you give it to them, nobody can put you back in bondage to sin unless you walk back into it. But we do. We have the potential to, let's put it that way. Because there's a proverb, real graphic proverb, that says, "Just as a dog returns to its vomit, so a fool returns to his folly." We've been set free from sin. We've been set free from bondage and addiction and all kinds of horrible things that were part of our past that God said, "You don't need to live like that." And he put us on a new path. But he didn't take away our choice to turn back and go to that old path. And a lot of times the suffering that we're experiencing is because we've turned away from God's path for ourselves and back onto a path that he tried to rescue us from. Now in Job's case, he isn't sure what's causing his problems. He doesn't believe it was brought about by him, and he's correct about that. But he just sits and he just scrapes. And then his three friends finally arrive. It says, starting in verse 11, "Now when Job's three friends heard of all this adversity that had come upon him, they came, each one from his own place." They were living in separate towns. They came together. Eliphaz, the Temanite, Bildad, the Shuhite, and Zophar, the Naamathite. And they made an appointment together to come to sympathize with him and comfort him. When they lifted up their eyes at a distance and did not recognize him, they raised their voices and wept. And each of them tore his robe, and they threw dust over their heads toward the sky. Then they sat down on the ground with him for 7 days and 7 nights, with no one speaking a word to him, for they saw that his pain was very great. Now, consider, if you're still trying to picture, how bad was this for Job, these boils? Consider this. His 3 best friends travel from different cities to come comfort him, and the first time they lay eyes on him, they don't recognize him. These boils have completely disfigured him. He doesn't look anything like the old Job. He's just a mess. And they start to cry. And just like Job did in his grief over losing his children, they tear their robes. They throw dust over themselves. And they sit down for 7 days and 7 nights. No one says a word. Now, this was considered the proper form of grieving. This same practice of mourning for 7 days over someone who has died. We see it in Genesis chapter 50. It says, "So Joseph went up to bury his father, and with him went up all the servants of Pharaoh, the elders of his household, and all the elders of the land of Egypt, and all the household of Joseph, and his brothers, and his father's household. They left only the little ones and their flocks and their herds in the land of Goshen. There also went up with him both chariots and horsemen, and it was a very great company. And when they came to the threshing floor of Atad, which is beyond the Jordan, they lamented there with a great and sorrowful lamentation, and he observed 7 days mourning for his father." I think there's a great lesson for us here, because when we care about people and those people are going through hard times, sometimes you don't know what to say. And in fact, you know what's sad? I've talked to people who have known of somebody in great distress, and they've chosen not to go visit that person because they'll say this, "Because I don't know what to say." But sometimes you don't need to say anything. Just need to be there. And that's what Job's friends did. They just came and sat with him quietly, because no choice of words could possibly be sufficient for what he was suffering. We, in the world we live, have lost the concept of the value of silence. Because we have all kinds of TVs, computers, iPads, iPhones, iTunes, and whatever going on. And it's not uncommon for me, I don't know about you, you may not work in an office, to experience this more than once during the week. I'm on the church phone, my cell phone rings. I go, "Hang on a second. Or, can I go right back, Lee? I'll call you back, all right? I'm on the church phone." "No, go ahead. Hold on a second. Yeah, can I call you back?" That's my life. Okay? I'm not complaining. I'm just telling you that's what my life is. That's why I don't watch television, by and large. I'll watch the game this afternoon, but by and large, when I go home, I don't want voices talking to me that aren't in my room. If my wife wants to talk to me, if Dora wants to talk to me, that's fine. I don't want the television talking to me. I've heard enough electronics for one day. But the Bible tells us there's a lot of good that comes out of silence. Proverbs 17:28 says, "Even a fool, when he keeps silent, is considered wise. When he closes his lips, he's considered prudent." Now, one reason why Job's 3 friends kept their silence for 7 days was because the proper Old Testament grief protocol was, don't speak until the grieving person speaks. Next week, Job will speak. Once Job speaks, it will unleash a torrent of words from each of his 3 friends that will go on for chapter after chapter after chapter. and it's not pretty, and it's not loving, it's not wise. Proverbs 10:19 says, where there are many words, sin is unavoidable. This song is called In the Silence. I would just like to encourage us, based upon what we're learning here in Job, to make a conscious choice to spend some time with God quietly somewhere. Hey, listen, it's great when you listen to worship music. Oh, that's terrific. But how are you going to hear God's voice if you don't shut up? Tired of telling you you have me when I know you really don't. Tired of telling you I'll follow when I know I really won't. 'Cause I'd rather stand here speechless with no great words to say. If my silence is more truthful and my ears can hear how to walk in your way. In the silence you are speaking. In the quiet I can feel the fire, and it's burning, burning deeply, burning all it is that you desire to be silent in me. Oh Jesus, can you hear me? My soul is screaming out, and my broken will cries, teach me what your kingdom's all about. Unite my heart to fear you, to fear your holy name, and create a life of worship in the spirit and truth of your loving ways. In the silence you are speaking. In the quiet I can feel the fire, and it's burning, burning deeply, burning all it is that you desire to be silent in me. Father God, we just come before you today, and we recognize the value. Maybe we have missed it, maybe we overlook it, but we recognize in your word the value of just being still and knowing you are God. In the midst of all the chatter around us, in the midst of all the struggles and the worries and the challenges that life is throwing at us, all that really matters is just to hear your voice coming through the silence and saying, I am here. That's all that matters. You don't have to explain anything. You don't have to tell us how you're going to fix it. You just need to say, I'm here. And we understand that we're not going to hear you say that if we don't just stop. Just stop. Be quiet and let you speak. That's our desire, Father. Teach us the wisdom of silence in your presence, that we might walk in the wisdom of knowing that you've spoken and that what you've said is all that we need to know. We just thank you and praise you that you do speak to each one of us about the things that matter most to us, because you care. And you know every hair on our head. And you know every situation we're going through. And you have answers. And you're working it all for our good. And if we would just get silent, you would whisper, it's going to be okay. It's going to be okay. We just thank you for this today in Jesus' name. Amen.